Hey, Dr. C here with you. So I had some questions about Wi-Fi and 5G. I've written in the past and done some videos and walked around my house and car with a EMF meter and made some content pieces based upon that. And many have reached out and said, hey, thank you, that was helpful to be aware of that, but what about 5G coming up? How does that change things? So let's talk about that. Let's make sense of it. So for starters, let's talk about what EMFs are. So these are electromagnetic fields, and these are fields that are generated from things that create a current. And if you put copper wires rolled up in a coil and run a current through those, they generate a magnet. If that current's strong enough, they can also generate heat. Now, the thought is that fields can have effects upon living things, and they can. If fields are quite powerful, they will have magnetic effects or heating effects. Now, there are also the thought about electromagnetic waves and EMFs and how they fit into the whole spectrum of electromagnetic waves. So I want to talk about that spectrum a little bit. I'm going to pull up an image to explain that and make sense of that. So here's that one. And this is the electromagnetic spectrum. The very top, you're seeing gamma rays. The very bottom, you're seeing radio waves. Now you see this squiggly line that represents the wavelength. Well, that is not proportion, not to scale at all, like not even. So radio waves, if you look over here, these wavelengths can be 100 kilometers long. So that's 60 miles. So the top and the bottom of the wave, the distance between one top and the next top could be 60 miles apart on radio waves. Down here, some of the shortest radio waves, 10 centimeters. So this is about like a popsicle stick as far as the wavelength difference. And now up here, once we get to X-rays and ultraviolet rays and down, we start talking about wavelengths that are smaller than the orbit of an electron around an atom. So I can't squeeze that tight. I can't make anything represent that size difference. So in the image, it looks like the wavelength is like maybe, I don't know, millimeter, half a millimeter apart. And then the bottom, this wavelength is like, what, 3 inches apart maybe? Yeah. So no, they're not at all proportioned, a whole different ballpark. These are little packets of energy that carry a photon, and the photon itself, the particle, moves in a wave-like direction as it goes forward. And the direction and the speed of forward movement is the speed of light. So they carry energy because they're moving fast. And the straight line movement is the speed of light, but they're actually going up and down as they're going straight. So there could be thought to be moving faster than that, or putting out even more energy than that. And then you think about the ones that are going up and down within the width of an atom and still progressing forward at the speed of light. Those are very high energy particles at that point. They're carrying a lot of power inside of them. So there's this cutoff line that occurs. There's visible light, which they expanded out and just shows you like a whole rainbow and how that works. And once we get at a lower wavelength than ultraviolet, violet and ultraviolet, now we're getting into ionizing radiation. And the word radiation is often used when someone's really referring to ionizing radiation. So ionizing radiation is radiation, electromagnetic wave, that can cause a chemical change within an atom without there being heat effects. So it does that because it's bouncing around within the orbit of the electron, and it can bump an electron out of place and ionize that particular atom or molecule. And that's why it changes it chemically. So when we talk about the dangers of radiation relative to X-rays or nuclear power plants or these gamma rays, we're talking about ionizing radiation and its effects. And they're totally real. UV light is carcinogenic because it has an ionizing radiation effect. But radiation in a broader sense is everything on that whole spectrum, even these big, long radio waves. So electromagnetic fields are part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and the electromagnetic spectrum waves in there can affect us in 3 ways, one of which is that ionizing power that I talked about. The others are going to be through heat or through magnetism. So let's talk more about that. And I'll bump out of the share real quick. So those first ways, the heat and the magnetism, those are true, and they're true for anything that's plugged in, anything that's a power source. However, they are mechanisms that are quite weak with any distance, and they're quite weak without really high amounts of current. So there's a phenomenon called the inverse cube law, which means for every 3 feet you are away from something, that power is 9 times weaker, 3 cubed, 3 times 3 times 3. Or if you were 4 feet away, that power is 16-fold weaker. So yeah, it diminishes rapidly with distance. Now, the waves themselves travel further than that. They can go for other distances, and some can pass through structures, some cannot. Radio waves, because of their long wavelength, they can pass through some things, but solid substances do slow them down. That might be why some parts of your house have better Wi-Fi than others. However, those radio waves, those things that are passing around through your house, they're not ionizing radiation. They're not having effects upon living things. If you were right up against the source of that, you may have a magnetic field, you may have a heating effect that's present, but really that's measurable, and that drops off within a matter of inches or a foot at most from the source. So the take-home message is you don't want to have electrical appliances or devices right up near your body, or especially not near your head for long periods of time. And by devices and appliances, things that plug in put out pretty substantial fields. Things that aren't plugged in, they are less relevant. However, the distance does make a big difference with that. There are many good EMF meters. You can get nice ones for between $50 and a couple $100, and you can see throughout your home, and you can see from your devices how much fields they're putting out and how much distance away you are when that occurs. So the argument has been about varying types of cell phones and cell phone coverage, and if cell phones have different effects. Well, cell phones are electrical devices. They do use a fair amount of power, and you can measure that when they are connecting to a cell tower. They do definitely generate electromagnetic fields. However, you can measure how far those fields extend. I wouldn't suggest holding a cell phone up against your head for long periods of time. The main concern that's been talked about and debated about is whether or not these things cause brain cancer. And it makes sense that that would be a concern, because if someone were spending a lot of time with a phone against their head, which many people have, that's an area of the body in which these effects could have a localized, pronounced action. There's the least distance because it's right up there against your head. And this has been studied. And over the last many years, there's a whole lot more people using cell phones than there were before 1980, which was basically zero. There were some car phones way back in the 80s, but before then, cell phones almost were non-existent, apart from just a few novelty things that were there. Let me show you a graph here about how the rates of brain cancer have changed over the time frame in which we've gotten to start using cell phones. So here's this. I'm going to skip ahead 2 images. Yeah, so here's the rate of adaptation of cell phone technology within US households. So in 1994, we had about 10% of households, of people in the US, that owned and used cell phones. Well, over the course by 2010, that's gone up to what, like just about 90% most likely. And if we could see data that was more current, it might well be even higher. And if we went back much prior to 1994, this number would get down to 0 pretty quickly. By 1980, no one had cell phones. It was basically 0. So over this time frame, cell phone usage has gone up just exponentially. Like no one had it to everyone has it. And cell phone usage, of course, will correlate with ownership. And probably in the early days, when there was fewer talk and concern about there being these risks, there were likely many people that had extensive usage, that weren't using headsets, that were holding it against their head. I had an early time in my practice in the mid-90s in which I was in that category. I was the sole person running the practice, including answering the phones and scheduling and responding to messages. And I had a cell phone. That was like pretty much the whole business was that in a room that I rented. So I spent a fair amount of time with a cell phone against my head. And I felt, subjectively, I felt that I had symptoms from that. I didn't feel good. It was also a time in which I was working, 14-hour days, no joke, 5-6 days a week. And most of my time was indoor in a windowless room. I wasn't exercising. So a lot of things were off. A lot of things were affecting me. I couldn't say I didn't feel well only because there was a cell phone up against my head. But I wasn't unusual then. A lot of folks were on cell phones quite a bit. So if the rate of cell phone usage, the number of people using phones and the amount of time we're spending on phones, if that changed so radically between 1980 and 2010, if there was any way in which cell phones cause brain cancer, the rates of brain cancer should have changed over that time frame. We should have seen them go up by something. You could argue that if cell phones went from 0 to 90% or from 10 to 90%, that, let me back up, that the rate of brain cancers, if there was a direct tie-in, should have gone up by what, 9-fold also. Well, let's take a look at that stat because we got that data too. So this has been studied pretty thoroughly. It's been broken down per ethnicity, and it's been looked at globally. And between 1975 and 2010, when the most recent data was available, it's been completely flatlined. These are rare cancers in general, but the cases per 100,000 people have been 5 per ethnicity, 5 to 6. Some groups will see a little bit lower, like maybe this is probably about like what, 2 or so, 1 or 2, and it's not budged at all. So just seeing this relationship and that relationship, it's hard to think that there's an association. If phone usage caused more brain cancers and phone usage has gone up exponentially, why haven't brain cancers changed at all? Why are they not different than they have been at any point in the past? So that's a valid concern. So let's talk now about just the idea of 5G and if 5G is a new technology. There's been concern about it, that it's now a higher frequency, that it's got shorter wavelengths, and therefore the properties can be completely different. The concern also stems from the fact that 5G will likely have more extensive tower infrastructures. And what happens is, we know that 5G is actually a weaker frequency in some senses, in that it cannot cover distances as well, and it cannot work around or between objects as well because of a shorter wavelength. Now, if a wavelength is shorter a lot, we can see a categorical difference. Let me go back to that image about the electromagnetic spectrum in general. So if you talk about a much shorter wavelength, way down, you can crank down to this radiation range, and yeah, that's different. But 5G is not a change to a different category of radiation. It's a change within the category of radio waves. So what we see is that here's the range of radio TV waves, and these are the sort of things that are used with cell towers. They're not even down into the microwave range. So 5G is on the lower end, the shorter wavelength portion of the spectrum. But what happens with that is it becomes less able to penetrate. So there's more power there, but it doesn't go through skin. It doesn't, and it's still not in this ionizing range. Now, I think a lot of the concern came about 5G from one specific slide. There's been quite a bit of write-up about this particular slide. This came out in 2000. There was a physicist who argued that the tissue damage, so the absorption of microwave or radio wave absorption, could be higher with greater frequencies. And 5G does start to come up into these frequency ranges. So taking this at face value, this could seem to be quite worrisome, that this could cause damage to the brain tissue. But the pitfall is, this gentleman was a physicist, but not a biologist. And follow-up work said he did not take into account the simple effects of human skin, not even bone, but skin. So these are waves that have a frequency, but they do not penetrate. So these waves have no effect past the skin layer. Now, if you could be exposed to a super powerful transmitter of waves in this frequency, they could make your skin feel warm, even at a distance of as close to 10 or 20 feet if the source was strong enough. But the power used by cell towers is magnitudes of order, literally thousands and hundreds of thousands times weaker than that. So these waves scatter around, but they do not generate observable heat, and they do not penetrate. So again, we can only think about things that ionize, things that create magnets, things that create heat. And these do not do that in the amounts that will be used. So there's really there's no apparent cause for concern. Nonetheless, it's good to monitor things and good to always watch and be mindful. So here's some action steps that I would suggest thinking about. And these are good action steps for any type of electrical devices. So one is that don't have things close to your head. Be aware of your sleeping area. So when you're asleep at night, your body is stationary and also you're more vulnerable. There's the least metabolic activity. Your immune system is in a less vigilant state as well. There's more repair going on. And be mindful of what's right around your head in your bed area. That can include wiring behind there. I saw that in our last house when I checked the Wi-Fi meter. You could see EMFs that were relevant within a couple of feet of our circuit breaker. And the way our house was set up, that circuit breaker happened to be in an area that we really weren't in very often at all. It was kind of a one far side of the house. And that was perfect. But it's entirely possible that circuit breaker could be outside on the wall adjoining your bedroom, right by where your head is at night. That wouldn't be good. You'd want to relocate the bed and be many feet away from that source. There are times too to where there could be electrical problems and high amounts of current that are behind a wall like that. Not as common when there isn't a circuit breaker present, but theoretically possible. That's something you would want to know because that would create a fire risk anyway. That would reflect poor wiring. And other things can be close to your head. One thing I've not heard talked about much, but one of the biggest sources of EMFs that I saw when I measured was a hair dryer. So these use a lot of power and they are close to your head. So precautionary principle, I would use more distance, or I don't worry about one, but ladies, you take better care of yourselves and that can be part of that routine, but just give as much distance as you can. And if there are ones that use less wattage, that would generate less of a current also. And devices in general, any device, give yourself some space, even a couple feet, and you're pretty good, you're pretty safe. If you are concerned, it's easy to grab an EMF meter and check around the house, but some things are different. So Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, these are radio waves, and as such, they can heat, they can magnetize, but they do not ionize. So they are not the same, and their effects are even more localized. So yes, using a Bluetooth device does subject you to less of an exposure than having the phone against your head does. And yes, your Wi-Fi being on does carry a signal throughout your house, but that signal is not one that has any biological effects. So you wouldn't want your Wi-Fi router up against your pillow because it would be generating some current, but nonetheless, you wouldn't need to turn it off at night if it were somewhere else in your house. There's no harm to doing so, but not necessary for biological effects. And the main thing to be aware of is just that the risks, the actual outcomes, because that's the thing. You can always say what might happen, but well, what has happened? What did happen? And we've got such strong data about brain cancer, and that's not everything, right? But that should be at least a harbinger. If these fields were harming us in some way, they should at least manifest right where a lot of folks had phones right up against their head. The other thing about early cell phones is they generated much more powerful fields than current cell phones did. And again, a lot of folks adapted them and had no clue about the fact that you didn't want to live with that thing against your head. So there were many super users for many, many years, and yet not even a blip in the rates of brain cancer. So I don't see any strong cause for concern. And based upon the physics of 5G versus 3G and 4G, there's really no plausible reason that 5G will be radically different. There actually were many who were sounding the alarm about 3G or about 4G, and nothing has happened. And that's the thing about, I don't know, about fear-based thoughts is like, well, it always could, like right around the corner. Well, it could, but if there's no real plausible reason, and if the prior causes for concern didn't pan out, somewhere a lot of the way, you got to think about the whole crying wolf thing. You got to think, well, at what point are you going to not be as worried about that? So, put your energy into things that matter. Think a lot about how much time you can spend in nature, the depth of your connections with your loved ones. Think about the quality of the food you're ingesting, about how much you're moving your body and how much fresh air you're getting, how much you're contributing to the world around you. Those are big needle movers. But I wouldn't put your energy into 5G and Wi-Fi apart from these basic steps that I've talked about. Hope that was a useful update for you. Take really good care, and I'll see you soon.